evening. On behalf of India Habitat Center and a Suitably agency, a very warm welcome to all of you who are here present with us and to all of you who are with us online. Our apologies that we are beginning a little late, but it's raining in Delhi, and that means a delay of 10-15 minutes is nothing to be surprised at. People are still walking in, but let's begin. Our books in focus in July have been the greatest Bengali stories ever told and the Penguin Book of Bengali Short Stories, edited and translated by Arunava Sinha. The greatest Bengali stories ever told features 21 unforgettable stories from the region. The Penguin Book of Bengali Short Stories is a landmark new anthology of Bengali literature in English, including previously untranslated stories. Bringing these books alive this evening are the author and translator himself, Arunava Sinha, in conversation with Somak Ghoshal. Arunava Sinha is an award-winning translator and teacher. He translates Bengali fiction and non-fiction into English and works of English literature into Bengali. He is a professor of creative writing at Ashoka University and co-director, Ashoka Center of Translation. Somak Ghoshal is a critic and writer. He is the author of 2 books for young readers and a new title forthcoming soon. He writes about books, art, movies, and podcasts in his regular newsletter, The Constant Reader, and his writings have appeared in numerous publications. There will be time post their conversation for you to take the conversation forward and interact and ask any questions that you might have. Please welcome Arunava and Somak.
Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm clearly audible. I'm very excited to do this today, but I don't know, putting 2 Bengalis in conversation about the Bengali short story, how wise that idea is. But we will, of course, try to make it as entertaining and, include all of you in this. This is a book club conversation, so it's not on me to actually just talk to Arunava. But having known him for many years, being a Bengali myself, having read these stories in Bengali, I think I want to start with the idea of the anthology, not so much the translation first. I think the challenges of creating meaningful anthologies are really underrated. I feel, there's always going to be people who will not agree with your selection, you will sort of struggle with it. And to create 2 books which have the best of Bengali short stories in them, I think that's the question I want to first pose to you. How do you anthologize? What's the process? What's the thinking behind it? And how do you create these new entities?
Please shout in protest if we lapse into Bangla at any point, as we might if we get excited. I can only speak for myself as far as anthologizing is concerned. And I gave it a little bit of thought when the idea of the first one came up in what are we trying to do or what should I try to do? And I very swiftly came to the conclusion that there's not much point trying to make it a sort of potted version of all of a literature. There's just too much of it anyway. And why let the reading stop at the anthology? So I turned it around in my head and said, let the reading begin here. So let the anthology provide doorways into more reading and therefore give you some ideas of what the literatures in Bangla can be like, so that you can then find out on your own or explore on your own. But even so, the question remains what to choose and what to leave out. And of course, I'm very fortunate in that I've been able to do 2 of them because I've managed to salve my conscience a little bit in terms of what I had to leave out the first time. But it was really eventually boiled down to stories I loved and stories that I'd read over the years, right from childhood, or stories that had been read to me even. And I just felt that it was a good way to, in a sense, return the debt or pay back a little bit of the debt by going back to the stories that had stayed with me all those years. Of course, it doesn't mean that I didn't go out looking for newer stories as well, or stories that I hadn't read, particularly for the more recent anthology. But I soon gave up the idea that this is the best of the title notwithstanding, that this is the best of, or that this is the only anthology you should read, or anything like that.
Yeah. I think, I mean, personally, I have a few thoughts about some inclusions, some exclusions, but I'm not going to go into those details.
You must. What if someone commissions a third one? They need to know what we've left
The more
out.
the better. I think Bengalis are underrepresented as it is. I'm sure everyone here will agree with me. But, you know, I want to go back to this first volume, the Aleph one that I'm talking about. And there's a very moving introduction that you wrote there. And the second one is, of course, a more historically grounded, scholarly introduction. The first one has this sentence in it that, you know, short stories are like guilty pleasures. And that I found quite fascinating. In Bengal, the short story has been alive for over 150 years now. Still, we publish. We have a very healthy culture of publishing little magazines, weeklies, quarterlies, where short stories appear.
And now the internet.
Now the internet as well. So I think I had twofold question here. One is to talk about the short story as this, you know, slightly stepmotherly entity that doesn't quite shine as much as the novel does. And the second thing to think about here, I think for me, was, you know, what does the Bengali short story mean? Because now we are looking at the diaspora, we are looking at Bangladesh, we are looking at West Bengal, people who live outside of West Bengal. So what does the identitarian sort of part of the short story come to mean to you?
Yeah, I discovered that there was an instinctive notion of the Bengali short story just by virtue of what you'd read. But when you start thinking about it in a framework or structured terms, you realize that it's much more than just stories written by writers who lived in and around Kolkata. So, for example, there's Bangla stories written by writers who live across the state of West Bengal. All the writers who live in Bangladesh or have lived in Bangladesh or East Pakistan or East Bengal before that. There's quite a strong Bangla literature which I have not touched at all and hope to someday from some of the northeastern states, from the Bangla-speaking parts of Tripura and Assam, for example. And then, of course, there is the diasporic writing in Bangla as well. There's also Bangla writing from other parts of India. Not every writer who writes in Bangla necessarily lives in Bengal. And naturally, the geographic and by extension historical origins mean that they bring different flavors and timbers to their writing. So it's really quite vast. And Bangla itself, you know, for example, for the Aleph anthology, the first question was, what about the writing from Bangladesh? If you're calling it Bengali, then how can we leave that out? And eventually, we kind of came to a compromise where we said there'll be a separate anthology for writing from Bangladesh. Not because of any reason to segregate the two, but simply because then you'd probably end up doing justice to neither side in one volume.
I think that's where I'm coming from. Like, if you look at the Bengali experience in the diaspora, if you look at the UK, US, even someone like Jhumpa Lahiri, who came into writing through Ashapurna Devi, she doesn't write in Bangla. Also, at least the first volume, what we saw is very much grounded in a diasporic context. But you can see the origins of the stories in the themes that someone like Ashapurna Devi would probably explore. So do you think that, you know, the writers in diaspora who are writing in Bengali, like the UK and the US, do we know enough of them? Are you sort of following their journeys separately? What does it look like, that landscape?
I know of a few, and they are kind of genre writers, or they write in certain specific styles. There's Kuloda Rai, for example, but you wouldn't really know that he lives in the US. There's a science fiction writer of Bangladeshi origin named Dipen Bhattacharya, who again writes science fiction, so therefore you wouldn't know. I'm not aware of too many others, to be honest, who publish their Bangla writing while living abroad. Some of them have approached me in the past to translate their work, and the difference there is that it's very much Bangla writing. You can see that their reading in Bangla has formed their writing sensibility, and it is set among the diaspora. But one great exception of a writer who writes living in the UK is Ketoki Kushari Dyson. She has written some fantastic novels. Noton Noton Pairaguli is the best of them, or the best known among them. She's also written 2 or 3 others. All of them are geographically located in the UK, where she has lived for many years, and necessarily her characters are also mainly women from various parts of the world who've gathered in the UK. And I hope one day to be able to translate Noton Noton Pairaguli. It's a mammoth, it's a 600-page novel, and I asked her for permission some time ago, and she said, I'm an old woman, wait till I'm dead, because I will make your life miserable if you try to translate it while I'm alive. Because she writes in English, she's an academic, and
yeah, I've known her for many years as well.
Yes, you know her.
So quite an institution.
I know, and you don't even know how to respond to her. I finally got her to agree to my translating a few poems of hers, and she said, fine, on condition that you send me the translations in 24 points in the body of the email, because I cannot read anything smaller than that.
And she herself has translated Rabindranath and many other writers.
Yes. She has this one fantastic novel called Rabindranath of Victoria Ocampo Chandane, where she alternates a love story with actual chapters from somebody writing a PhD thesis on Victoria Ocampo.
Yeah. I think that kind of crossover figure in Bangla writing. So I was just also thinking of Nirmal Verma, who wrote novels set in Europe. And they're such quintessentially European novels, although we read them in Hindi. Very few Bengali writers, I mean, Buddhadev Boshu is a classic example, I think. One person who traveled the whole world through his writing and reading. Like, he wasn't really physically in many places, but there's a very moving passage in Buddhadev Boshu's letters where he says that every time he travels abroad, and this was happening much later in his life, in his 50s and 60s, he seems to have already known that place from a book that he's read. So when he's in England, he's looking at England from the eyes of Dickens and things like that. So what I'm trying to get at is, you know, this cosmopolitanism that we talk about, like which Ketuki Kushari Dyson is a very good example of. How contained is the Bengali short story within the context of West Bengal, Bangladesh, and how cosmopolitan is it in contrast?
Yeah, no, it's not really very cosmopolitan in that sense. I think those who lived and wrote there pretty much thought of that space as the entire world as far as they were concerned. And the best of the writing happened at a time when travel was not really feasible. And there was no internet, there was not even television in many senses. So all the inputs as the lives they lived were mostly centered around them, their own physical world. But as you said, the literary world was indeed one that came in from the West, primarily from the West. And you see that reflected in a lot of the writing. You see you see, for example, existentialism reflected in quite several of the short stories and novels of the writers in the 70s and 80s. You see some American influences. For example, Shandipan Chattopadhyay, I discovered, after having translated one of his stories, that he actually had based it on a story by what we talk about, Raymond Carver. So then I realized that, went back and started looking at this, and then you can start seeing the American influences there as well. So the literary influences were, I think, quite cosmopolitan.
Yeah, because also the Hungry Generation and the Beat Generation, the overlap between the two, and Deborah Baker's very famous book, A Blue Hand, on that, of, you know, the Hungry Generation meeting the sort of Beat Generation and sort of alchemy happening.
Yeah, yeah, and the Hungryalist poets actually wrote in a mode that was very close to Allen Ginsberg and so on. You know, that howl kind of constant ranting and going higher and higher and higher.
Yeah. So, just in terms of representation, right? So, why did you exclude Sunil Gangopadhyay and Shakti Chattopadhyay, who are really sort of iconic in their own ways, especially Shakti's shorter prose, I think. Yeah. What is the thinking behind that?
No, that's the point. I didn't exclude anyone. I couldn't include them. It was, my original plan was to do 50 stories, and the publisher said no. So it came down to 21 eventually. But I managed to get Sunil Gangopadhyay into this one, the Penguin one. Shakti, yes, someday I want to do an anthology of poets who wrote the fiction of poets. Yeah. And almost all well-known poets up to a point, or even recently, have all written fiction. So even if you look at current times, from Srijato to Mondakranta Sen, Mallika Sengupta, and then going further back, Sunil Gangopadhyay, Shakti Chattopadhyay, I discovered that even Subhash Mukhopadhyay has written novels, Sharat Mukhopadhyay has written novels, Jivananando, of course, yeah. Most certainly. And in fact, there's a whole world waiting to discover Jivananando. Mallavan has been translated, yeah. But Jalpai Hati, for example, then as you yourself said, the two books you were talking about. And there's one very beautiful short novel which I wanted to include, but I couldn't for reasons of length. It's a novella. It's called Nirupam Jatra. So right. That's the scary thing. Having done all of these, I still discover that you barely dipped your toe into it. And I'll let you into a secret. I'm actually working on, another anthology now of Bangla writing, which spans different forms, not just fiction. So there's fiction, poetry, non-fiction, screenplays, theatre, plays, essays, and a couple of even jokes. And I keep expanding the list. Right now, my number is 125 writers, and I could take it to 200.
That's something to look forward to for sure. But
not for me. I'll never finish it.
Let me now get into one particular section which I found very fascinating in this one, which is Purnendu Potri. You have chosen this book, Kathopokathon, which is Conversations, how you've translated it, which is basically a poem, right? Is it a short story? Is it a poem? Why did you include it here?
It felt to me like a short story, in verse. It was clearly, two people going through a certain, meeting each other and then going through a certain stage in their relationship. And this is only the first of 4 volumes, as a matter of fact. The story goes on till they both get much older. She leaves, she gets married, she goes to France, comes back. It felt very much like a story to me.
Yeah, I think the narrative quality of that piece is very interesting, especially those of you who read Bangla. I think if you read Kathopokathon, you will see that it's a really unique product of its time. I don't think anybody wrote in that style.
Nothing like that ever again.
Yeah, yeah. I think one more thing I really want to, kind of dive into is translation as a practice, right? So there are many theories of translation, ways of approaching translation. For me, one of the most memorable ways of thinking about translation is by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, who said that don't homogenize the language for a global audience. Keep it real, keep it difficult for any audience, keep the essence of Bangla real, basically. So I was just looking at the first story, Jibito Amrito, which is Tagore's very famous story. And Tagore's Bangla is, of course, of a very different, kind of Bangla. We don't speak it anymore. We don't write like that anymore. Do you feel that something is lost in translation when you are actually trying to bring that essence into English, especially when you're sort of standardizing the language into the standard spoken English? Or is there a merit in keeping that English register even higher, like an 18th century, 19th century English?
Okay, so this of course is a fundamental question. And I don't know that there is any one right answer to it. I can only tell you the answer I've chosen at various points of time, and that's changed too. It's not as though I follow always the same way of doing it. Part of it has to do with what one is capable of doing and not capable of. Can I write like a 19th century English writer? No. In fact, I recently did an experiment where I translated something and gave it to ChatGPT and said, turn this into 19th century English, just to see what it looks like. It looks like rubbish. So my thought was this, that I'm interested in reproducing the reading experience, because I think that is where you can do the most justice to the original text. When I'm reading it in Bangla, I have a certain relationship with the Bangla language, and I'm able to read with a certain ease. Even when the Bangla is dated, I'm still able to read with a certain ease, even if some words stump me. And I realize that maybe I would not have constructed my sentences this way today if I were writing. But it's, by and large, unless the writer intends it to be otherwise, a smooth reading experience. And it allows you to interrogate the text with a meditative approach, with a thoughtful approach, and not to sort of jump at what have you written, what does this mean, why is the rhythm so different, why is it so weird, and so on. Unless in some cases the writer intends it to be that way. Now, to do what Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak is suggesting is indeed to say that I'm giving you Bangla in English, but because you don't know Bangla, you're bound to jump and stumble and so on. And that is my intended experience for you. Now, that's a perfectly legitimate way that you might ask the reader to read it. But I felt that that would not do justice to the reading experience intended by the writer, who was, after all, writing for people who read in the same languages they write in. So I opted for the reading, I sort of prioritized the reading experience, if you like.
Yeah, because I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And where I was coming from is that Bengali is a very idiomatic language, and it has certain nuances which you can never capture in English. And what do you do with that then? Like, how do you make those choices? How difficult are those choices? How do you sort of make peace with the choices that you're making?
You don't exactly make peace with it entirely, and you always know that there are some things you haven't arrived at. But equally, the language you're translating into sometimes offers things that you can do there. So you try to take advantage of those. And while I hesitate to use the word, it suggests that something is lost, I will be the first to accept that something is changed, for sure. Because obviously, it's, as Walter Benjamin said, you're dressing the same subject in a new set of clothes. And if the same person wears two sets of clothes, it's not because they want to look the same. They want their appearance to change, right? So obviously the story or the text is going to be different in another language, especially when that language shares very little with the original language, either culturally or etymologically. It's far easier, for example, to translate between Indian languages. I've just done my first Hindi to Bangla translation, which is Srikant Verma's Magad. And I was actually astounded at how simple it was in many ways, because the words almost, in most cases, you can use the same words. It's really as simple as that. Which also helps the sound and rhythm to be preserved. In English, when you're moving from Bangla, any Indian language to English for that matter, or for that matter Japanese or Chinese to English, you're certainly not going to be able to preserve the sounds and the rhythms and the idiosyncratic expressions. Bangla, as you will know, everyone's tired of hearing, is full of repetitions, for example, right? Pran hu hu kore utlo, matta kaka koche. These repetitions of sound, hu hu, kaka, jha jha. Any sound you make, it holds meaning for us.
Onomatopoeia.
Onomatopoeia. Yeah, not even. I mean, jha jha, what sound does it suggest? But you know exactly what it is. Now, you can spend half a life agonizing over the fact that you can't bring this into English, or you can lump it and move on.
Yeah.
And try to arrive at something similar in a different way. The tool may not be the same, but ultimately you want the rider to feel that sense of vast emptiness.
True, true. Does it become more complicated when there are writers who have translated their own work into English? Like Tagore, for instance, Gitanjali, he did a version in English, then Yeats did another version. Bad. It is very bad, but from our vantage point, I think when we look at it from his...
I suppose.
And he also translated Hamlet and all these things into Bangla, so he was very bilingual in his own way. What does it look like in that case?
Well, the best person to answer that question would be Clinton B. Seeley. Clinton Seeley translated Buddhadev Boshe's novel Raat Bhor Brishti, It Rained All Night, and he sent, and this, 1960s, so we are talking about typewritten manuscripts, and he mailed it to Buddhadev Bose in Kolkata, because Seeley was back in the US then, and to have a look at it. And Buddhadev Bose told him, I have no time to look at this. I absolutely have no time to look at this. And 3 months later, the whole thing arrived with his corrections. And of course, it's virtually his own translation. Yeah. I mean, Clinton B. Seeley would have done a fantastic translation, but Buddhadev Bose was fluent. So he wasn't going to allow anyone else to translate him in his lifetime, which is why Ketoki Kushari Dyson told me to.
I think Buddhadev Bose is himself guilty of translating from French, and even Shakespeare's sonnets and things like that. And the young man addressed in the Shakespeare sonnet becomes a woman in Buddhadev Bose's Bangla. Yeah. So he took enough liberty with a lot of translations to make peace with his own understanding of what was going on.
Yeah, so, one day if I could write a novel about Shakespeare confronting Buddhadev Bose, or a short story at least.
I don't think that will go down very well, really, the confrontation between the two. I think I want to also hear from the audience, because this is a book club conversation and I have a lot of thoughts, questions, but I don't want to hog all the attention today. So if you would like to ask anything, comment on any story that you've read and liked or want to talk about, please feel free. Is there anyone who would like to do that? Okay, there are two hands. Yes. First the gentleman, please, and then we'll come to you.
Tend to read Hindi novels or Hindi literature in general. For example, one we would know for sure it was Mr. Harivansh Rai Bachchan, who was a luminary in English, but he wrote in Hindi and very good at that. So how frequently do you delve into that, and how frequently in general the English writers do that? I mean, Hindi literature.
I can't speak for other writers, I'm afraid, but I certainly hope they do, because I'm sure they would like to consider themselves part of the writing tradition that's located here in this part of the world. Many of them do. I'm quite sure of it. Many of them do. I know Amit Chaudhary does, for example. He's a colleague of mine, and we have discussed Bangla literature. So I'm sure they do.
Any personal favorites in Hindi?
In Hindi, I read very little of Hindi, to be honest. I intend to read more in Hindi, but I've read a fair amount of translations. So Shrilal Shukla, certainly. And Gitanjali Shri.
The Tomb of Sand.
Yes, but also her earlier novels.
Empty Space and
The Empty Space and Roof Beneath Their Feet.
Hello, and thank you so much for these wonderful translations. As a probably really only fluent English speaker and reader, I'm super grateful for you translating them from Bangla, which I don't read at all. And for me, as a native English speaker, they've all translated so fluently, so eloquently, so evocatively that they all brought back, I mean, many of them, especially I kind of first started off with this one and thought, oh, brilliant, the second one's going to be really quick to read too. And then came to this one at the beginning of the week and was like, wow, okay, I'm only this much through. But from the beginning to the end of this, I kept finding so many beautiful stories that really evoked memories and made me think about experiences from either childhood or other times that I'd spent in India, different parts of India. And what I wanted to ask really was, so many of your kind of ideas about translation and about how you choose a story to put into an anthology, and you've discussed it a little bit, but you've also written about it so well in the introduction, is when a story has moved you with heart and mind, that you've really kind of felt it, lived it, got into the middle of the tale. One thing I wanted to ask was, you've kind of talked a little bit about reading books up a tree as a child, and a bullet whizzing past your ear, and another time when you knocked on the door of Satyajit Red's door, you know, how those stories kind of came into this anthology. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about memory and the art of translation, and whether it's the memory of the time that you first read the story that is so evocative and so pressing and so kind of prescient almost that you need to translate it and write it into an anthology, or whether the situation, the environment, the place you read it had so much emotion attached to it that's why the story became so magical or kind of came to life. So which comes first, really? Is it the experience of the first reading and the emotions that brings about, or is it the actual reading that evokes a kind of higher sensibility of the place that you're reading it in, and then that place and the whole world, everything around us, suddenly takes on a kind of higher dimension? So it's a bit of a long question.
No, you're right, of course, and it's not either or, in the sense that certainly the reading triggers memories, and then you go back to those earlier times and places. But as a translator, I always want to reproduce that experience of reading a story for the first time with great excitement and immersion, when I don't know what's coming on the next line, when I don't know the ending, and when I have a certain innocence, if I were to use a word, that will allow me to let the story envelope me and me to enter it completely without being cynical or literary or critical about it in any way. Because, when we were in college, we read very critically. We were taught to read very critically. And it was also quite fashionable not to particularly like anything very much. you always had to point out the flaws rather than, and in a sense that full-bodied reading was something that leaving that academic world helped me to regain. When you could read without any guilt, and not have to justify the fact that you loved a story to any of your peers. So it's that feeling that I think can really take a translation a long way.
Brilliant, yeah, thank you so much.
Faithful to the original, because it's just not possible, for reasons already mentioned by you. I look for the fact whether the translator has good command over the language which he is using. If he is evocatively is able to give the gist of the story, I'm very happy. Now, regarding the selection of stories in your book, I want to know why stories written by short stories of Taslima, Bangladeshi writer, and Ma Sheta Devi do not figure in your book.
They do actually. Ma Sheta Devi's stories do.
Okay.
Taslima Nasreen, again, as I explained, we decided that we would have a separate anthology for writers from Bangladesh. So it was more a technical reason than any literary reason. But in the context of fidelity, I wanted to tell you something that Borges famously said. You know this one, Somak. And he was, of course, out to always make people wonder. He said, the original is not faithful to the translation.
I think you touched on a very important, your question especially, reading for pleasure and translating for pleasure as well. And you're absolutely right. I think when we go through our institutional education, we are not taught how to read with pleasure. It's kind of a forbidden word. You don't read with your body and mind, you read just with your brain. And that's something translation can't afford to do. You really have to communicate the one you said, the jha and the jhon and all these sort of very physical kind of sensual kind of nuances of language, basically. So I think that's a very important point that you raised.
Yeah, in fact, I'd like to quote a fellow translator who interestingly, V. Ramaswamy, who interestingly, and this can only happen in India, I think, who is a Tamil, who has spent all his life in Kolkata and therefore translates from Bangla into English and can't read Tamil as far as I know. But he once pointed out that translation is a problem of language, not of literature. I couldn't agree more. In fact, if you know too much of literature, it's an impediment.
I completely agree. I think one of my favorite translators is Lydia Davis. And right now she's translating from the Norwegian, which she knows very little of. But she's actually doing it because her target language is so good. And what she can make sense of using a dictionary and grammar books and etc. is enough for her to give us a stellar translation. So I think I completely hear what you're saying. I think we'll come to you. We'll take some questions from people who are online. And unfortunately, I'm unable to read these questions, so if you can please read them out.
Manisha is asking us, which of the authors are easier to translate and which are the toughest?
The easiest authors to translate are those who write very well. Really, and the toughest are those who write
very well.
Less well. I mean, their stories may be great, but if the way they write is not brilliant, it's much more of a struggle to translate. Because, you can aim to translate quality. How do you aim to translate, not, what I mean, not mediocrity, but something that's less than, imagine cooking and saying, I want it to be only 70% good. So
you wouldn't translate those authors anyway, would you?
Normally not, but things happen. Sometimes you get fooled into it because the first 100 pages are fantastic. And then on page 120, oh no, what a...
You're telling a book critic about this, so very true.
Pooja Sodi is asking us, as a reader, how can we judge a translation when certain writers like Tagore, Chekhov, Manto, even Baburnama is translated by so many people? How to go about selecting which translation to read?
There can be only one original, but you keep getting newer translations. Which one? Pick one up. I don't know. Pick one up, see if you like it. If you don't like it, read another one. It really is as simple as that. But pick the latest one, I would say, normally. But also, I'm sorry for what I'm about to say now, but see who's published it. The choice of publisher can make a difference because there's a certain quality control, for lack of a better word, that is associated with some publishers and not so much with others. But look at the newest one simply because it's more likely to speak to you in the current times. For example, there's a lot of feminist writing which was quite understated in when it was originally written. A lot of translators have really gone out on a limb and done much more to it. For example, Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, where she does this fantastic thing of pointing out that the original is quite sexist. And she's actually done a version which tries to restore the balance. And I think this kind of creative intervention can be very good in the case of retranslations. When you've already read one version, but here's one that is telling you what it might have been. And great stories always get retold anyway.
Yeah, just don't go by Amazon recommendations. That's one thing I would just tell you.
Those are gamed anyway.
Neerja Narang is asking us, what according to you are the non-negotiables when it comes to choosing a book to translate? Does the worldview and politics of the author play a role?
I think the only non-negotiable is that it has to be a great book. Everything else follows. Now, whether worldview and politics is part of the matrix of decision-making as to what makes a book great is up to the individual. You may not like a book because it espouses the politics you don't care for. Is Lolita a great book or not? What does one say? You hate everything that goes on in there, right? But you have to call it a great book nevertheless. So the best thing about literature and all art is that it doesn't give you very easy binary answers to anything.
It has been made into a movie as well, Lolita.
It has.
Well, some things are necessary to also translate, right? Like whether it's good, evil, whatever your relative scale of judgment is. Some things need to exist in the world for us to know that they were there. And I think there is a very fair case to make for such a thing. Would I want to translate, Hitler? No. But somebody has done it for me and I know it exists in the world. So if I want to see what he did, his life, I will have access to that translation. I think translation in that sense is also a service.
It is. And if you're pushing back against something, you need to know what that something is that you're pushing back against.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, please.
Very simple question. Which story was very surprising? Which story shocked you? Which left you awestruck? Which left you angry, confused? Different stories and different emotions.
That's not a simple question. And I don't even remember right now. It's very hard to sort of immediately start thinking back. But there are some writers, of course, who specialize in certain rasas. So, for example, the Bengali writer Bonapul, who wrote these very, very short stories, short stories. Surprise was an integral part of his story. In fact, the story burst into life and meaning only with the surprise at the end. It wasn't just the conventional twist in the tale. It was that the entire meaning of the story, as it were, resides in that surprise that comes at the end. Stories, almost all stories in Bangla make you sad and angry. It's something we do. We are sad and angry people. And when we write, it comes out.
Politically also very strongly opinionated, so that's also part of it, I suppose.
Politically strongly opinionated. And in fact, again, that anthology I mentioned, I was looking at the kind of writing that, and one of the most amazing things is how much writing in Bangla has originated in prison. A very large quantity of writing has begun in prison. So many people who were imprisoned for various reasons actually wrote about their life and worldview over there. So obviously that's going to upset you, it's going to sadden you, it's going to also fill you with resolve in some way. And I think one of the things that translating does is that it makes you read very closely, perhaps more closely. I would say that a translator knows a story better than the author themselves. Because the author at least has has moved on. The translator can never move on, you know. It's that relationship which never ends. So you realize what a debt you owe as a reader to all the writers who have written in your language. So much of this writing has formed you, formed your thoughts, formed your ideas. You just don't realize it, but it's happened. And then when you go back to the text and start thinking about it, you realize how much you owe to all these texts. It's quite incredible, really. And I think, I'm sure it's true of all languages, but I'm speaking for Bangla because I think most of the people from our part of the world who've shaped our ideas have done it through their writings. At least maybe that will change in the coming generations, but up until my generation, it was all through their writings.
Yeah, and just to interject, that there are very fun stories as well. You've forgotten Rajshekhar Boshu and Namanita Debsen and writers like that.
There are great fun stories.
Yeah, we are not just sad and depressed and angry people.
No, we are not. Namanita Debsen is a classic example, yeah. In fact, I'm very proud to say I'm in one of her stories.
You are in one of her stories.
I am in one of her stories.
Which story is that? You have to tell us that.
It's not here. I mean, I've not translated it. Several of us in college who studied with her elder daughter are in it, including her daughters, of course, have been in all her stories, many of her stories, shamelessly exploited, as they say. The story in Bangla is called Bhalobasha Kare Koy.
I see.
And our names have been very thinly disguised. Very thinly.
Anyway, our nicknames are not much to write home about. But anyway, please go ahead with your question.
Hi, Arunava. My question is, would you like to touch upon how different the experience is translating a short story and translating a novel?
It's not really different because you are, as I said, translation is a problem of language. So other than the fact that you will finish translating the short story much more quickly, there's no real difference in the way you're treating them. Pretty much the same, I'd say.
I think translating a poem might take as long as translating a novel.
Yeah,
that is a curious thing because even a few lines, you just have to get it right. And it might take several months to actually get to that point when you're able to let it go.
Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, poets often say that their lines just pop up in their heads, made, rather than deconstructed. But translation can sometimes be a process of deconstruction and reconstruction. If you have that facility where the entire translated line also pops up in here, once in a blue moon it's happened to me, but I am no poet. So.
But I suppose translating a poem must be slightly more challenging.
Much more.
There is that form, there is that rhythm.
Yeah. And you have to make some unfortunate choices because you have to decide what to forefront. But you can't capture everything.
Again, to speak of it, like Gitanjali is a classic example of, it can be a terrible translation or it can be a beautiful, mellifluous translation, depending on how you do it.
How about this 60 years rule, as you said, in other countries?
Copyright rule.
Oh, the 60-year copyright rule. Yeah. It's very simple. 60 years after an author has died, their work goes into the public domain.
In India, it's okay, but in other countries,
it varies between 60 and 70 years.
Throughout the world?
Throughout the world.
Okay, thank you.
That's why sometimes writers, estates actually lock things up. I mean, Jivananand is a classic example. There was this gentleman called Bhumendra Guho who kind of monopolized his writing after his death for many, many years, and no one had access to it until now. I think Bhumendra Guho is no more, and we have access to Jivanananda because...
Bishwabharati did the same thing with Rabindranath. Yeah. And in fact, Bishwabharati wanted to keep the copyright in perpetuity. And it was because of their demand that the copyright law in India was changed to extend the period from 50 to 60 years. Used to be 50. He died in 1941. In 1991, the copyright would have gone out, would have ended. And a Bangla publisher, a very well-known Bangla publisher, had printed all his works with the idea of, because until then only the university press could publish him, had printed all his works with the idea of putting them out in the market. And last moment, the government of India extended the copyright by 10 years.
Good evening. When I was in school, I used to read these comics, Tintin comics. And when I grew up later on, much later, I realized that they have not been written in English in the first place. They were in some other language, French or Belgian, I think.
French.
And the translator, whoever translated it, changed the names of some characters too. So what do you think of, or how do you rate this kind of a translation?
I think it's fine. Leslie Lonsell Cooper and Michael Turner, translations of Tintin. But the gold standard for me of translations of comics is the Asterix comics, which are so full of puns and wordplay, and translated by Anthea Bell and Derek Hockridge, but mainly by Anthea Bell. Derek Hockridge was a technical consultant. And Anthea Bell famously explained how she translated the Asterix comics. She said, I didn't translate joke for joke, but if there were 3 jokes on a page in the original, I would make sure that there were 3 jokes on a page in the translation. And of course, because the wordplay around the names was so crucial, of course she had to change the names. Only Asterix and Obelix, then their names remain the same. But if you look at the English names, Dogmatics, for example, I don't even know where the brilliance ends there on Dogmatics. All of them. Fully Automatics, Dogmatics, Chief Vital Statistics,
yes.
Impedimenta, you name it. And all the jokes are wordplay. So I mean, what these translators have done is extraordinary. Absolutely. I mean, Dupont and Dupont, I think they're called in French, and they became Thompson and Thompson without a P.
Well, same with the Bangla Tintin, right? Like Leela Majumdar translated, I think, from French, some of it.
Some of it, and then Nirendranath Chakraborty translated.
And Snowy became Kuttush, for instance.
Yes.
Thompson and Thompson became Ronson and Johnson.
Johnson.
There were all these changes made.
And that's true, actually, for the translations into all languages. Everyone's taken that. I think that's the kind of freedom that ensures fidelity.
Like if you translate Shukumar Rai, for instance, you will never be able to do it in any kind of manageable way because it's nonsense verse. So it's up to you to choose how to do it, and you have translated as well.
But what Shukanto Chaudhary has done with Shukumar Rai is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Truly unbelievable. I mean, please everybody read Shukanto Chaudhary's translations of Shukumar Rai's poems. Published by Oxford University Press, who do a very bad job of making the book available. I hope there's someone from OUP there.
And it looks really like something you wouldn't want to buy.
Yeah.
So, you know.
It's tragic. I mean, I have a good mind to bootleg that book.
The author as a translator, I mean, how is that process different? Because we know Haruki Murakami writes in, Japanese, he translates into English, and then he kind of writes in Japanese. There is a process that he kind of...
I think that's a story he made up, huh?
Okay.
I mean, Murakami told this story about how he became a novelist, where he said he was watching a baseball game and somebody hit a shot and a fielder got up and caught the ball in his mitt, and at that point he decided he had to be a novelist.
I don't know whose word.
It's a classic, it's a beautiful story, but it's classic Murakami. And then he said he started writing in English, and he wrote 2 chapters, and then he said that, no, this isn't working in English, I'll write in Japanese. Yeah. But because he had written in English, he was hardwired to write Japanese as though it's English. That's what
exactly.
he said.
So that's what, anyway, so we kind of, shelved that. The second thing is that you've also got like Shake the Bottle, Asha Purna Devi's stories, like an anthology of her stories only with a theme, the strand of interiority of women, all of that, domesticity. How does that work pan out as a translator? I mean, is that monotonous for you as a translator to slot, one writer's stories in one volume? Or, what does that do to the story, 1? 2, what about the specific thing about Bengali stories? Like, where would you where is the topography, history, politics of Bengal affecting these themes that are running sort of... that could be common to all the stories.
There's 3 questions.
Yeah. You've negated my first question.
Authors do translate their own work, and I think they translate it very freely, knowing that this is my work, so I can do it as I like. Said Waliullah, who is a writer from Bangladesh, or rather from East Pakistan, he translated his own work into English, and the English version is quite, well, not quite different, but significantly at variance from the Bangla version. And, that's something that the author can do. And if a translator does, then the world will jump down their throat. I don't know where that liberty ends, where it begins, how it works. You may not call it a translation. I mean, everyone's translating Shakespeare all the time in modern novels, and that's perfectly permissible. So that's one. No, it's not boring at all. I mean, it's like translating a novel, but where each chapter has a different flavor to it. It's actually even more exciting, if at all. And Ashapurna Devi, I mean, if I could live long enough, I would translate each and every one of her 3,000 stories for everyone to read. She was absolutely outstanding. She's an outstanding writer, especially of short stories. And the most amazing thing is that almost all of them are set within the four walls of the home. And I've read very few writers who can point so sharply at all that is wrong with us. You know, how mean we can be, how nasty we can be, how short-tempered we can be. You know, she doesn't look at people she doesn't turn anyone into a hero. It's fantastic what she does. And your third question was about the politics and the topography and so on. Themes, yeah, I mean, they're all built into the text. So unless something absolutely will make no sense to a reader in another language, I do not try to explain it or gloss it or anything. Or even if I do, very lightly, just to provide a little context that may be lost on the reader. But not otherwise. I don't think Bangla literature would have existed. That's true for any literature. But Bangla, I can speak for more authoritatively because of having read some of it closely, would not have been the way it was had it not been for the politics of the region, most certainly. And by politics, I don't just mean the more visible face of the politics, like everyone thinks of the Naxalite movement of the 70s and so on. But we're a very politically informed race, not always with the most progressive of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, Anandamot is like going back to that moment when it all started. Of course, the ideas are questionable there as well.
Yeah.
But politically very grounded, as you just said.
Very grounded, yeah.
Any other questions?
When you're a child or a teenager, you read a story. And then when you grow up as an adult, you read a story. And the different phases of your life journey. So does that somehow, obviously that affects interpretations at different levels. So does that, like, if you have read a story when you're in college and then you're translating it right now, those memories and interpretations, do they act as, I'm not talking about confirmation bias, but somehow does it affect? And it could be good, it may not be good, so that's my question.
You're right, and I'm sure it does. But it's not something I actively try to either accentuate or fight against. You know, an experience of reading a story is in you. You can't really unexperience it after that. So if your first impression was formed 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, then there's more than a vestige of it stays with you, certainly. Of course, sometimes you also find that a story or a novel that you thought was fantastic when you read it then turns out not quite to be as likable at this point of time. But that again also doesn't make it universally a bad piece of writing. It just, you may have outgrown it. So these things certainly make a difference. I mean, I started translating about 17 or 18 years ago. And I'm pretty sure that I would not today be able to translate some of the books that I did back then because I was a different person. So you're right in that who you are at a particular point of time greatly impacts what and how you're translating. There's no doubt about that. Translators are certainly not machines who can take any text and make a version of it without in some way putting themselves in it. We try to remain invisible, but that's consciously. Unconsciously, I don't think it's possible.
Maybe I want to ask you something related to this. Are there any favorite writers you would never want to translate because you're too scared? That's a very tough responsibility, actually.
Yeah, quite right. Scared of you're right, of spoiling that beauty that I encountered in...
Or they are sort of looking behind your shoulders and seeing, what you're doing, and this is a writer you really love and grown up admiring, so would you rather or rather not?
The very fact that I can't give you an answer right now means that maybe I've gone beyond that point of caring. But no, I mean, I am always anxious. And in fact, the more you translate, the more doubts you have. When you start out, you have that arrogance of youth not chronological age, but youth in your field, and you think that I've pulled it off. Yeah, what's the problem? But as you do more of it, you realize that it's a minefield.
And also what, this question was about, confirmation bias and so on, how reading informs our current perceptions. Recently I was reading a book, and I can't remember which one. It almost came with a statutory warning that, the names, the historical incidents mentioned in this book are sort of questionable now. The politics has changed, the way we look at the world has changed, but it's a translation, so you have to include certain choices of words and things that the author originally used. Have you ever encountered a situation where you're deeply uncomfortable with the text and you don't really know what to do with it, translating from this lens of time, basically?
I did with Sharadindu Bandyopadhyay's Tungabhadra Thire by the Tungabhadra, which very clearly had an anti-Muslim bias in the characters. I'm not going so far as to equate it with the author's viewpoint, but certainly in the characters and the narrative. But I didn't think at any point of diluting it or changing it or anything. What I did do was add a note saying, don't blame the translator. But this is the text.
Yeah, I think history also lands up in trouble quite a lot. Yes, please go ahead.
What is this artificial intelligence impact on this translation business?
It's a vast source of entertainment right now. Fortunately, and I'm too old for it to affect me in my lifetime. I fear for younger translators in case it gets better at it. Right now, it's just very funny. Because the thing is that artificial intelligence works at the level of, it's a language learning model, right? So what it does is it looks at linguistic patterns and gives you an answer to your question based on what has already been written along similar lines.
ChatGPT.
Sorry?
ChatGPT also.
ChatGPT, exactly. So it can't create, it can only synthesize from what is already out there. And as any writer or translator will tell you, if that's all you're doing, if you're synthesizing, you're never going to do anything that anyone will remember, even if they read it in the short run. So I feel quite safe, and sometimes for fun, when I'm getting very troubled by a piece of translation, I go and ask them to translate something, and then it's, oh wow, this is so good.
Thanks.
I mean, if you have used Google Translate, you will know that it's not the best, most reliable source.
No.
Anyway.
But it's also hilarious sometimes.
Because, translation also, this question is very interesting because it's not word for word translation. Why do titles of novels change in English drastically sometimes from the original title? Because there are no equivalent sort of words in English to do justice to it.
Yeah. No, literature is what is not in the words, but between them. And that's what you have to translate, or hope that that's what your translation arrives at.
And the richer the languages, I think, of course, all Indian languages are very rich, but I know Bangla very well, so I'm speaking for Bangla here, that even the word for night, Ratri, has like 20 different words. So when you're translating a word like that into English, you're just saying night, and it just flattens the experience.
These are the things that flatten out. Ratri, the moon, another example. And then, of course, you have all these funny situations, like when you're talking about the searing heat of May, and then I get this irate letter from a British lady who says, what do you mean, searing heat of May?
Yes, I can see some. You want to ask anything? Yeah.
So, adding to this point I'm asking you, this really reminded me of, it took me back to college when I was doing my English course. And my teacher mentioned this aspect of translation, especially in Indian languages, because Indian languages tend to be extremely colorful, and there's a lot of expression, there's a lot of idioms. There are a lot of things within Indian languages that can't accurately be or convey the same effect in English. So she gave the example of something in a Tamil short story, which happens to be my native tongue. So usually there is an expression in Tamil which roughly means that you are feeling uncomfortable or about something, and it's called Vayatarichal, which translates to, if you translate it from that, it doesn't make sense in English. So
what is the literal meaning?
So the literal meaning is my stomach is burning. So a lot of people who read that part of it wondered why. They thought the person had acidity, and it was very hard to understand. But it actually meant that something was making that person feel uncomfortable or jealous. So how do you like bring in these nuances? And you said that Bengali is also a idiosyncratic language. How do you bring these nuances into translation without having to explain too much?
Yeah, no, there's no one rule. Sometimes you may find an
without having to have a glossary. At
sometimes
the end.
Glossaries suck. Sometimes you may find a corresponding expression which works well. Sometimes you may just want to say that the meaning is more important than anything else. Sometimes you may also want to do a colorful translation which does not, however, evoke that strangeness, have what are the favorite food of the Bengali, the Jelusil tablet. So sometimes, so it doesn't evoke quite that response, but at the same time gives you an unusual expression. And I think it's a great thing to be able to stretch the language sometimes. You don't only have to stay within the existing confines of the language into which you're translating. You can do some things to it, and then it's up to you. Does it sit well? Is it flowing nicely? Is it conveying something and intriguing the reader? So based on all of these, you can make a choice or choose to do it one way or another. Sometimes these actual translations of colorful expressions can be quite good. They can be quite effective sometimes,
Also today you can actually look them up online. And
well, nobody's going to do that. I mean, who's going to read a book and say, stop it, let me look it up? Although on Kindle you can.
As a curious person by nature,
no, you're right. But sometimes you can do it beautifully. I mean, I read in a translation recently the expression, her sleep broke. And it's not something that someone writing in English would normally write, but yet it's fine, it's beautiful actually, and it also takes you back to those who know the original language, it echoes it, and those who don't read a beautiful new expression and still get the meaning perfectly. This is something that translators can do. This is something writers in English do nowadays. Because those who write in English don't necessarily come only from the white world anymore. They come from India, they come from Africa, they come from other parts of the world where English is spoken, and they're stretching the language all the time.
Not to the extent that we are Bengalis, we eat water, which is what we typically do. Basically.
Well, they eat soup, and excuse me.
I remember a very funny anecdote. I was once teaching a group of kids, and we were teaching them daffodils, Wordsworth. And one kid just stands up and said, "What is a daffodil?" And I said, "It's a flower." And then that kid has no actual idea of what it looks like, why he should be bothered about daffodils sitting in India, and where can you find it, which garden, etc. So that's when I realized that even when you're teaching something, there is translation constantly going across cultures.
Yeah. And I think many of our teachers, with all respect, ruined poetry for us by framing the question, what is the poet trying to say? I'm like, if the poet is trying to say it, then they're not doing a very good job, right? So why must we look at it that way?
And also to write summary of a poem or something like that. Poem. Yeah. Some of us who had education in the 80s were subjected to it. I don't know whether kids still do it, but
I hope not.
Yeah. Yes, Anand.
So do you think of the reader when you translate? Are you translating for people who have a nostalgia for the original language, or those who have absolutely no idea of the culture or experience of what you're trying to translate?
Yes, the latter. I assume that they know nothing about the culture or the language.
Have you been tempted to correct the original then?
I'm sorry, tempted to correct?
Correct the original to place it in the current context so that the novel is complete? Because
no.
It might be lost if it's too
No, that would be, I treat the text as sacrosanct. Absolutely no interference with the text.
No interpretation as it were.
No conscious interpretation. As I said, unconsciously I'm sure I'm reading something into it that will be different from what you will read into it, but not deliberately trying to change anything to update it or to make it more palatable or more politically correct or anything of that kind. I mean, for example, if you look at sexism was hard-coded into writing in 1950s, 60s or earlier, and it really makes you cringe the way the men characters are talking about women. But cringe, that's the whole idea. The whole idea is that if I were to read that in the Bangla today, I will cringe. So if I read it in English today, I should cringe. I should not feel that this is great. That's the whole point.
How do we maintain rhymes in poems?
Sorry, rhymes?
In poems.
Very, very hard. Because sometimes it can come out as doggerel.
Sort of impossible.
Shukanta Chaudhary again.
Yeah, Shukanta Chaudhary is the master as far as that is concerned, because he does it without making it look like doggerel. But I doff my hat to anybody who can translate in rhyme. It's especially between Indian languages and English. Between contiguous languages, it's not so hard. Well, yes and no. I mean, to some extent, yes, but you can maintain rhythm, and even if it's not rhyming, in your head you hear a rhyme, although it's not explicitly there on the page, if you can handle the rhythm very well. So, yes, I know what you mean, but a little bit of it goes, but I wouldn't say all of it goes, because again, to say that everything in a poem lies in the rhymes would also be oversimplifying it, I guess. There is a website called Rhyme Zone, which I use a lot. By the way, as a translator, it's you should actually use all the possible tools like thesauruses and dictionaries and so on. You know, not everything has to reside in your head. In fact, it doesn't have to come from your head. Translation is about choices. It is not necessarily about coming up with the solution instinctively.
And sometimes expanding the scope of a word rather than word to word translation.
Yeah, like the famous story, I don't know if it's true or not, the Russian doesn't have a word for blue, it has light blue and dark blue. So when you're translating from English into Russian, you have to make a choice.
I think we have lots of questions, thoughts, but before we conclude, I think one thing I want to ask Arunava is, you know, this translating writers from Bangladesh, their Bangla, and the writers from West Bengal, this side of the border, what is the essential difference? How do the registers change? Even in the most urban context, I'm talking about Selina Hussain and all these people. So
the thing is, you treat the language of Bangladesh as a language in itself, and not necessarily as a version. The moment you do that, everything falls into place. Then you just have to make sure that you're reading it correctly, because it's not a language that you're using yourself. So you speak to a lot of people, you use the dictionary much more, and so on. But other than that, it's the same, really.
Right. I just feel that the register is very rich there, and compared to less bilingual, for instance.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's rich and perhaps more earthy and less global. In that sense, quite right. So that is something you have to appreciate, treat it in that sense, in that way. But the moment you start centering yourself in the Bangla of West Bengal, and you know, it's very, you derisively refer to the Bangla of Bangladesh as Bangal, then you've lost the game, if that's how you look at it.
Right. Are there any questions online, or can we wrap up now and maybe Arunava can have a chat with all of you if you're signing books after this, maybe. So thank you, Arunava, for this evening. And I had real fun talking to you and listening to the audience.
Thank you so much, Somak.
Yeah, always fun to talk to a fellow Bengali about Bengali literature.
And we did not speak in Bangla.
Well, we used Bangla words, I guess.
We used Bangla words, that's different.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. So the thing is that for political reasons, the Kolkata version of Bangla became the dominant Bangla of Bengal when it was a single state, because the capital was there and the power and influence was all centered there. So already people started looking down at the other versions of Bangla as dialects and spoken by the country yokels and so on. Now after the partition, when East Pakistan and subsequently Bangladesh became a separate country, naturally the Bangla that was spoken there as the natural language was this other version. And it was quite fashionable for people from West Bengal to look down on this language and in the people who spoke it for that matter as being country bumpkins. So it's equally true that over there also they think of the Bangla spoken on this side of the border as a very weird version. But of course, as far as I'm concerned, they're just two languages who have a lot in common, but they're separate languages. Good old-fashioned elitism, absolutely.
The Britishers partitioned it much before, like early 20th century, 1905 or something. Bengal, partition of Bengal, when it was part of India.
They did, but they took that back. That partition never really took hold in a cultural sense. It was an administrative divisioning, but they had to roll it back. After Mohun Bagan, the team I hate, won the IFA Shield.
I'm taking offense here.
Yeah, tumi ghoti ki?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, we have finally lapsed. See, that's the thing. You have these terms, ghoti and Bangal, for people from this side of the border and the other side of the border.
Yeah. Also, I think the Bangla of Bangladesh is much more inflected with Urdu and other words.
Now.
Especially
increasingly now.
In the, the tribal languages, all of that. It's a very, very rich, cosmopolitan sounding Bangla. It's not as Sanskritized and...
No, it's not. That's right. In fact, historically, Dhaka was the cultural and administrative and financial capital of Bengal. Calcutta didn't even exist at that time.
Thank you so much, Arunava and Somak, for such a lively discussion. It's been wonderful. The books are available outside. Please do get your copies signed. And on behalf of Suitably Agency, many thanks to our partners, the India Habitat Center. Our next session of Suitably Booked will feature Namita Gokhale, who will be in conversation with Ambri Satwik on her book, Paro, on the 24th of August. The details and registration link will be up on social media channels next week. We look forward to seeing you. Thank you for being a part of Suitably Booked, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.